So, good morning. It's all of yours good fortune that Hannes Swoboda gave the introduction in the space of about 5 to 10 minutes. It is to my great misfortune, because most of the points that I'm going to raise, he's already covered. So I hope that maybe we'll even disagree, although by the sounds of it, we don't disagree on a great deal. So it may not be obvious. This, I have to say, Europe after Ukraine is a very, very broad subject, and so one is necessarily selective, and there will be various areas and themes which I won't touch upon, but I'm going to try and touch upon one or two which maybe have not been obvious to everyone. And another thing that's not obvious to everyone is that we've already seen the start of the much anticipated Ukrainian armed forces counter-offensive in the east and south of the country. Or let me put it another way, we are currently listening to the overture. That is, the Ukrainian leadership has asked its top brass to play some of the themes which could become familiar when the full orchestra is engaged in the coming weeks. The flanking maneuver around Bakhmut, just as Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin was claiming final victory in the city itself. The sudden emergence around Belgorod of a Russian resistance force. The targeting of Black Sea fleet vessels. The sending of drones to Moscow. Just yesterday, the Ukrainians released pictures of a HIMARS missile attack on the combat control center of Russia's S-400 anti-missile system in Kherson Oblast. Ukrainian officials are denying responsibility for most of these attacks, except for ones like the HIMARS, which are obviously coming from Ukrainian forces. Sometimes, however, those denials are intentionally undermined by what is effectively a non-verbal wink to the camera. There is a reason for them to cultivate this ambiguity. For these attacks we see at the moment have a dual purpose. One, to lower the morale of Russia's civilians, hinting that this may be about to become more than just a spectator war for those hitherto protected by Russia's borders. And second, to keep the Russian military guessing as to what the Ukrainian strategy will actually be when the counteroffensive finally starts. In private conversations, senior Ukrainian officials readily admit that their armed forces do not currently have the capacity to restore Kyiv's sovereignty over all the occupied territories. Instead, they are likely to seek to cause as much damage to Russia's strategic control over the occupied areas in order to provoke a crisis within Moscow itself. The more pain they inflict, the higher the likelihood of a political meltdown in the Kremlin, or at least so the Ukrainian theory goes. The Ukrainians are equally aware that the next few months represent the best chance of decisively influencing the outcome of this conflict. As Kyiv well knows, 2024 and the presidential election campaign in the US that culminates on November the 5th of next year will impose strains and limitations upon the Biden administration's willingness and ability to provide weapons, intelligence, and political support to Ukraine. A Trump victory would likely lead to a major geopolitical recalculation. Less dangerous for Ukraine, but important to note nonetheless, especially given President Erdogan's victory in Turkey on Sunday, is the rightwards drift in Central Europe. Hannes has already mentioned Donald Tusk and the constraints being placed on him in Poland. Well, as things stand, Viktor Orban does not look as though he intends going anywhere in the near future. There is much talk about Robert Fico returning to government in Slovakia. And while Austria is one of the most stable countries I have personally experienced in many years, its politics feel highly volatile at the moment. To paraphrase Oscar Wilde, losing one moderate government within a year is a misfortune. Losing two not only looks careless, seen from Brussels, Central Europe would start to resemble an emerging problem, just at a time when many believe that power shaping the EU is moving eastwards. All this is really to say that with regards to Ukraine, we have too many known unknowns, too many possible black swans, both on the battlefield and in the wider theatre of politics, to have any confidence in what the impact of the conflict on a post-war Europe will be. In simple terms, we don't know who's going to win. Nonetheless, we can make a stab at three possible outcomes. One, a Ukrainian victory and a Russian defeat. Two, the gradual cooling of the war into a frozen conflict, but one which I suspect would thaw much more easily than other frozen conflicts around the periphery of the Russian Federation. And three, a Russian victory and a Ukrainian defeat. I'm afraid it's too complicated and to a degree redundant speculation to map out what each scenario might imply for Europe. And so instead, I want to look at those problems which Europe will face regardless of the outcome of the war. And these we can divide into two categories. There are those which are already well known, established, but remain stubbornly insoluble, and those which are less well known, but will become very obvious in the next 5 years or so. So first, that first category, let's go back to Central Europe and the possible strengthening of populist governments in the region. Apart from weakening the unity of the EU in its policy towards Ukraine, or perhaps more accurately, strengthening the influence of Putin indirectly within the EU, the political trends will pose a serious threat to the European Union's core political values of democracy and the rule of law. We already have one country, Hungary, in the EU, which can no longer be defined as a functioning democracy because its government has throttled the accountability mechanisms upon which the rule of law depends. Viktor Orban's Conservative Political Action Congress, or CPAC, styled, of course, on the grand gatherings of the American right, is potentially a moment of real significance, as much of the rhetoric, it was held, of course, earlier this month, focused on the EU's warmongering in Ukraine, that's a quote, or the accusation that the EU is, quote, the center of a globalist conspiracy trying to put its clutches around Hungary. I'm personally sensitive to this because I was and remain a passionate opponent of Brexit in my own country, the United Kingdom, although I'm sure you'll all be thrilled to know that because of the foresight of my grandfather to be born in Newry, County Down in 1896, I am now the proud possessor of an Irish passport as well, and so still as European as all you Europeans here. The economic, constitutional, political and social damage which Brexit has inflicted on the United Kingdom is now slowly becoming clear to all parties except the true believers in the project. Now he has assumed the office of Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak is confronted with the fearful reality of Brexit. And I know from talks with people close to Sunak that he believes it to have been a mistake, even though he was a supporter of the project in the first place. Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, knows it as well, but is too afraid to articulate it because he is so desperate to regain the votes of the Red Wall in the North and the Midlands. But as I shall examine later, it is the industries associated with the digital world, renewable energy, and others related to the green transition that will suffer most in the UK. I know that most people, incidentally, and my prognosis is that within the next 10 years, we will probably be back in the single market. That's certainly what the CIA believes. I know that most people, including the EU, are fed up with Brexit. I get that, but it has one very important lesson for remaining states. The great mistake of British populism was to set itself an achievable goal, i.e., leaving the EU in order to satisfy the nationalist urges of its supporters. Once you've achieved that goal, something which Orban has never set himself, Kaczynski has never set himself, Trump never set himself, but once you achieve a goal like that, you have to own it. Above all, the Conservative Party has to own it. Anything that happens after your goal is achieved is your responsibility, whether it is cucumbers and tomatoes disappearing from your supermarkets, a steady decline in foreign direct investment, a long-term reduction of GDP by 6%, having to queue for over an hour in an airport before you reach your holiday destination in Marbella, or like me, having to pay up to 40 euros customs duty when a publisher sends you an unsolicited book from London to Vienna. Now that a steadily growing majority in the United Kingdom believes that Brexit has been one big confidence trick, the Conservative Party is cannibalizing itself. Like Saturn, the revolution is now eating Tories, nutty faction by nutty faction, over breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Brexit is the primary reason why many right-wing populist movements in Europe have toned down their exit rhetoric. Instead, their goal is now to strip Brussels of any powers of political coordination while maintaining the benefits of the customs union and single market. In the eyes of Viktor Orban, those benefits not only should, but must include the generous subsidies which allow the Hungarian economy to tick over. Those who believe that Europe needs a more integrated model in order to survive in an extremely dangerous geopolitical environment must address this central question. Now that Orban has lost the protection of Angela Merkel, he is under greater pressure than before. But there is nothing that Viktor Orban likes better than a good fight. The second challenge is not unrelated to the first: migration. To have any long-term perspective, the EU needs a significant injection of foreign labour every year. Some of its member states or inhabitants may not like that, but if we are to sustain both our competitiveness and our growing population of pensionable age, we have very little choice. There is, of course, no shortage of people very keen to lend their labour to the European Union. The great challenge is, how do you manage that flow without unsettling existing inhabitants and without placing too much strain on the infrastructure? Well, in the age of Schengen, that means there has to be consensus amongst member states. A senior European Union diplomat once described Europe, this is a few years ago, about 3 or 4 years ago, as being surrounded by a necklace of fire. Conflicts or potential conflicts run from Belarus through Ukraine, Armenia, Azerbaijan, down into the Middle East and onto Ethiopia, Sudan, South Sudan, Libya, the Central African Republic, Chad and Niger. When I asked one of France's senior diplomats 3 years ago what threat most frequently wakes him in the middle of the night, he answered without hesitation, Algeria. We can expect a permanent flow of desperate refugees seeking to get into Europe for the foreseeable future, and we need to manage that properly. The third challenge is enlargement. While appearing decisive, the move to jettison Moldova and Ukraine up to the top of enlargement's hit parade has highlighted the EU's failure in the Western Balkans. Starting with President Macron's decision in 2019 to block Albania's and North Macedonia's applications, now being aped by successive governments or non-governments in Sofia, the EU's performance over the last 5 years has been risible in this respect. This is a region that is surrounded by EU member states, that has a population of a mere 17.5 million people, whose integration into the Union would offer sufficient security guarantees to effectively neutralize Russia's political influence in the region and to eliminate the dangers of conflict breaking out locally. The events in northern Kosovo over the past few days should be evidence enough of the risks Europe is running here. In recent months, Germany, France, and the United States have attempted to exert coercive power on both Belgrade and Pristina, but both Alexander Vucic and Albin Kurti still perceive the process as a game of chicken in which the person who swerves to avoid the oncoming car of his opponent first could end up facing existential domestic political problems. It is very striking, as reported in the Financial Times today, that the United States has openly criticized Albin Kurti for his actions over the past week. I cannot recall the Americans being quite so blunt with an ally of theirs in the Balkans as the State Department has been with Kurti today. But if Serbia and Kosovo were to reach an agreement opening up the path to EU membership, then I am convinced, and I can argue it in detail if anyone's interested, but it's probably beyond the scope of this, that most other constitutional problems in the Balkans will become much easier to solve. Serbia-Kosovo is the Gordian knot for many reasons. Should the parliamentary elections in Montenegro, by the way, next month return a reformist pro-European coalition, then a creative thinking Brussels might want to consider absorbing this country of less than 1 million people in order to send out the strongest possible signal to the Western Balkans that this European territory, i.e. the Western Balkans, has not been abandoned in the wake of Ukraine. Serbia, incidentally, is set to play a critical role in the less well-articulated, but without doubt primary challenge facing Europe. And here I move on to the second category, energy and the green transition. The EU has determined that by 2035, the great majority of vehicles must be powered by battery. That will mean 10 to 15 million cars every year manufactured as electric vehicles. In order to do that, Europe will need close to 1 million tons of lithium carbonate, 20 times as much as the 50 tons that it currently consumes annually. Europe currently produces 2 to 3% of that 50,000 tons. And this is higher than the equivalent figure for most of the other 37 critical raw materials which Brussels has designated as strategically vital for the Union. Serbia possesses one of the largest supplies of lithium in Europe. President Vucic recently cancelled an agreement with Rio Tinto to develop the mines, citing pressure from green protesters. This is widely, in Belgrade, regarded as a cover story, as Vucic has never succumbed to protesters before. It is rumoured that China encouraged this strategy because it too would like control over that lithium. Vucic understands the value of this lithium as part of a wider, indeed monumental political game, the scramble for CRMs, or critical raw materials. Just as Mexico, Indonesia, and Chile have in the past 2 years nationalized their critical mineral reserves, or a large part of them, Vucic is wondering how to leverage the most from the potentially very lucrative lithium reserves. I understand that Vucic also intends to develop a gigafactory for battery production in Serbia, and if possible, to process the lithium so that Serbia does not have to engage in the European practice of importing its lithium processed from China. Europe would be most unwise to miss the opportunity of collaborating with Serbia on the development both of its metal reserves and their processed products like batteries. Until talks between the EU Commission and the European Commission and the Biden administration on a possible joint plan for the establishment of supply chains of strategic raw materials are concluded, the EU will be in competition in Serbia not only with China, but with the US and Australia as well. This is why challenges such as the resolution of the Kosovo issue are not merely desirable, they are imperative. With the Critical Raw Materials Act published last month, or rather in March, I beg your pardon, the EU has articulated its commitment to establish secure and environmentally acceptable supply chains of those raw materials, 38 in the EU, 50 in the US, that both have deemed strategic or critical. This includes the 17 metals known as rare earths, along with other elements, notably lithium, copper, nickel, and cobalt, all of which are currently essential for the manufacture of batteries which power electric vehicles. The absence of a secure supply chain in most of these critical materials threatens the predictable manufacture of 15 industrial product sectors, without which society can barely function and without which there can be no green transition, ranging from laptops through wind turbines to electric vehicles. First things first, most rare earths and critical minerals are not rare at all. There are significant reserves on every continent, including Europe. However, to extract a kilo of a rare earth element like neodymium, probably the most important rare earth because it's used in the most powerful magnets needed to power wind turbines, this involves digging up tons of rock, tons of aggregate, which creates significant pollution that can have serious consequences for the health of local flora and fauna, including humans living or working in the region of extraction. It is also a significant contributor, ironically, to carbon emissions. This is the primary paradox of the green transition. The upstream of the supply chain is massively polluting, although levels depend upon the nature of extraction, whether the mineral is in rock or water, the location or type of initial processing, and the regulatory framework of the secondary processing. In the late 1980s, the United States had a global monopoly on the extraction and processing of rare earth metals. But as part of its strategy of turning China into the heartland of US manufacturing, it also outsourced the rare earth metal industry to China as well. Beijing then developed a vast rare earth extraction, processing, and manufacturing capability in Inner Mongolia. China does not have significant reserves of some critical materials, lithium, copper, nickel, or cobalt. Furthermore, its rare earth mining operation in Inner Mongolia has proved so damaging to the local environment that it has now largely outsourced the mining of its rare earths to countries like Myanmar, where China is literally blowing up mountains to extract this material. However, it maintains a near monopoly on the processing of all critical raw materials, including rare earths, lithium, and copper. Indonesia has imposed a ban on all exports of its huge nickel reserves, critical for current battery technology, but has allowed a single country, China, to build processing factories close to the mines that ensure Beijing's monopoly on this product, even though the processing takes place outside Chinese territory. And incidentally, the only other really significant producer of nickel in the world is Russia. So draw your own conclusions from that. China can turn virtually all raw materials into tech-ready products for 30% of the cost than anyone else in the world, which is why last month, Ford in the US agreed to outsource its new battery production to the world's largest producer, CATL, in Ningde, China. The news is unlikely to please the Biden administration, for whom onshoring of critical raw materials processes is a key provision of the Inflation Reduction Act. Europe is over 90% dependent on Chinese processing of all these metals. The ambition to create 30 battery gigafactories in Europe by 2030 is admirable, but I want to tell you it is hopelessly unrealistic unless Europe assumes greater control over its mineral supply chains. Where the US is already swiftly acting to do this, Europe is dragging its feet. Even the Americans are worried about the rapidly growing Chinese influence and control of raw metal supplies, not just in Africa, but even in Latin America. US automotive manufacturers are scrambling to ensure their supplies in order to comply with the Inflation Reduction Act. For many years, Europe and the US have administered successful technology export controls, primarily to prevent the Soviet Union, later Russia, and China from accessing the most valuable and sensitive research. Well, earlier this year, there was a major development in this, which to my mind has been unreported. For the very first time, China imposed controls on the export of mineral processing technology to the West to prevent the emergence of other centers of processing. I believe it's essential to work with China in the development of green technologies. But unless the EU ensures it has secure access to the immense amount of critical raw materials that it needs for the green transition, then we will become fatally dependent not only on Chinese products, but on Chinese technology. If left unchecked, I am convinced that China is aiming to, at best, reduce the European automotive and renewable energy industries to satellite branches of its own. At worst, they will try to destroy these industries. In terms of Europe's future prosperity, there is no sector more vital than that of critical raw materials. If Europe is to meet these targets for the green transition, it needs to do two things. It needs to dig up large parts of its own landmass, and it needs to cultivate much better relations with partners in the global south. Europe has significant supplies of lithium and other critical raw materials buried underground. Here in Austria, in Carinthia, Carinthia boasts one of the biggest deposits of lithium on the continent. Northern Bohemia, the Erzgebirge in eastern Germany, Portugal, and across Scandinavia, geologists have found a rich variety of key minerals. But local people are quite reasonably not always thrilled at the prospect of some giant mining corporation churning up their green and pleasant land. And so we come back to the hidden paradox. If we want to reduce our CO2 emissions, we need lots and lots of mining, processing, and waste management, which will damage the environment. Throw in the fact that corporates are preparing to make huge money from the industry, and the moral complexity of rare earths and critical raw minerals deepens. The EU has struck two strategic deals with mineral giants in the past 5 years. One is with Canada, which has a lot of stuff underground, but must engage in sensitive negotiations with representatives of Canada's First Nations if it is to access it. The second is our own local mineral superpower, Ukraine. Russia's motivation for going to war with Ukraine was almost certainly prompted by perceived security concerns and Putin's warped interpretation of history. But access to critical minerals comes a very close second. Rather than excavate its own territory, Europe's preferred option is to get its raw materials from the global south, which has vast deposits and a willingness to sell, although increasingly and justifiably on its own terms. As the EU discovered to its evident surprise over Ukraine, its arguments often fall on deaf ears in the global south. As I indicated earlier, the EU is lagging behind both China and the US in striking deals with suppliers. It needs to be much more proactive in this field if it is to keep up with its competitors. And it must begin to think with much greater geopolitical intelligence. I think it's worth highlighting another statistic here. Between now and 2030, 55 nuclear power stations are scheduled to open around the world. 6 of these will be in Europe, including Turkey. The rest are in the global south, everywhere from Bangladesh to Argentina. Of these, Russia will construct 23 and China 19. This translates both into immediate political influence, but also extraordinary economic influence, as Russian and Chinese engineers and computer scientists will be in charge of operating these plants. Related to the issue of critical raw minerals is Europe's management of technology. This has become acute in the past 6 months with the dawning realization of the power of and the dangers posed by artificial intelligence. We urgently require much greater human supervision of generative pre-trained transformers, or GPTs, and their development. This speaks to a broader issue about technology across many sectors. It is critical that we create structures enabling human oversight of the introduction of new technologies. Look at the field of biotechnology, and matters are somewhat different. In December 2019, a court in Shenzhen, China, sentenced He Jiankui, a researcher, to 3 years in prison for the crime of illegal medical practices after he collaborated with 2 others in the production of genetically edited embryos. The court ruled that the 3 defendants had deliberately violated national regulations on biomedical research and medical ethics and rashly applied gene editing technology to human reproductive mechanisms. This outcome was welcomed by governments, scientists, and broader publics around the world. There is a wide consensus that the manipulation of human genes must be strictly controlled. This is made much easier as a lot, although not all, research into gene therapy is conducted in universities, which themselves are under much stricter state and educational supervision. When it comes to computer technologies, however, an entirely different structure and value set exists. Governments have little or no control over innovation in technologies, the implications of which are every bit as far-reaching as gene manipulation. But computer technology lies to a large extent outside state regulation, in the hands of giant corporations whose primary aim is profit, and for whom the concept of innovation is viewed with an almost divine reverence. This is very familiar to those working in cybersecurity. Innovation is always seen as more important to the high-tech industry than security, which is why the combination of GPT and the Internet of Things poses immense headaches for computer networks around the world. I've recently been researching the impact of GPT on the publishing industry. This was, I gave a talk about it at the Leipzig Book Fair recently, and the reason I did so was because in April I was in New York and I had dinner with a very a well-known and excellent publisher called Morgan Entrikin, and I asked Morgan what was going on with GPT. This is in April. And he said in December of last year he received a manuscript from an agent. The agent told him it was a new author and a very exciting author. Morgan read it and he said the first half of the manuscript was absolutely fantastic and he wanted to publish it. He said the second half fell away, as most thrillers do, which shows that GPT can also understand that most thrillers are badly written in the second half. And it repeated that. Anyway, he went back to the agent and the agent confessed that ChatGPT had written this manuscript. Morgan then declined the manuscript and said he wouldn't publish it, but it has since found another publisher. And if any of you want to speculate intellectually about this, read a story by Roald Dahl of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory fame from 1954 called The Great Automatic Grammatizator. You can find it on the internet. Everything that we're seeing roll out in the publishing industry, more or less, Roald Dahl wrote in 1954. Here is not the time to go into many of the details, but this technology is going to be making entire professions, middle class and working class, redundant in the next 5 years. This will also have severe consequences for issues like copyright as well. The deification of innovation is particularly pronounced in the United States, notwithstanding the hair-raising warnings coming from some of the leading developers of GTP and other AI technologies about the risks we run by its uncontrolled introduction. The Chinese response has perhaps predictably been to ban GPT in the People's Republic. We cannot yet know how effective that will be. But here, Europe must lead in producing the essential guardrails to manage the disruption and havoc that AI is already wreaking in sectors such as education. A few days ago, I was under pressure to read a lot of books in preparation for my participation as a moderator at the Haif Book Festival in Wales. I confessed to a friend that I was running out of time and couldn't possibly manage to read 2 more books and prepare the questions in time. Don't worry, said my friend, just use ChatGPT. I laughed, but stopped laughing when I realized my friend was being serious. Finally, the Planetary challenge. As the United Kingdom is finding, forging your way through the storms of contemporary geopolitics can be a very lonely passage indeed. It was the Inflation Reduction Act and Europe's response to Biden's strategy of onshoring and rebuilding the American jobs market, which finally led the British establishment to realize that it was squeezed between 2 trading leviathans either side of the Atlantic, and a China who will be equally, if not more brutally pragmatic when it comes to its relationship with Britain. Europe has several fundamental weaknesses which it must urgently address if it is to compete in this new great geopolitical game. But it must also calibrate its relationship with the US and China in the knowledge that the biggest challenge of all, climate emergency, is a global problem that can only be solved through planetary cooperation. The traditions and the values of the EU will be vital in achieving this, but it's going to require political leadership of a maturity which I certainly haven't seen for at least 3 decades. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much for this very open and thought-provoking expressions of challenges Europe and the whole world is facing. So just to summarize, from populism in the Central Eastern European countries, but also Austria particularly, migration, enlargement issues, energy and green transition issues, raw materials, which are quite important for these new technologies and the green transition, the new technologies itself, like genetics and artificial intelligence issues, and the planetary challenges and climate issues and the role of EU, China, and the US in that. Meaning, having heard this talk, the only silver lining was in a way that the UK will enter the single market in 10 years or so. But else, I haven't found very much optimism in your presentation. So you might give us some hints also what would be kind of optimistic outcomes and how to solve these problems maybe from a new perspective.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. So I change the tone of what I say depending on who the audience is. So to this audience here, I thought there's absolutely no point in trying to pretend that everything is, wonderful and jolly and so on. But if I'm speaking to an audience whose members do not spend most of their time engaging with these or similar issues, I make the talk much more upbeat. And there's a reason for that, until Armageddon happens, it hasn't yet happened, and there is always something you can do about it to prevent it. But critical in that, apart from, I believe, that final point I made about political leadership, is getting ordinary citizens involved and engaged in finding the solutions and acting upon the right path, which is why I'm a big supporter of things like citizens' assemblies, for example, because was particularly struck of the role the citizens' assemblies played in the 2 referenda in Ireland, one on divorce and one on abortion issues. And citizens' assemblies have not, that's not the only place that they've taken place, but in those areas where citizens' assemblies have been deployed, it has been remarkable the increase in engagement from ordinary people in complex problems. So, my message elsewhere tends to be, in principle, all of these problems are soluble, but are solvable. But we need all to be engaged and putting as much effort as we can into dealing with them. I mean, it's a particular difficulty, but the unity and diversity issue in the European Union is a strength in one respect. I mean, it didn't work with the United Kingdom, but it allows people to explore their multiple identities, and most Europeans are quite happy with that and quite enjoy the cultural opportunities in the broader sense that the European Union offers. But it does mean it's very, very difficult for the European Union to act coherently when confronted particularly with challenges, although Ukraine undermines what I'm saying slightly, particularly with challenges which are real emergencies and require quick action. But as I say, my optimism lies in the fact that human intelligence, although about to be overtaken by artificial intelligence, human intelligence, the collective wisdom of humanity is still really, really significant. And we know we have the technical solutions to solve a lot of these problems. What's missing is the political technology required to go along with it, but we have a lot of clever people who understand how politics could work better as well. So there is optimism. It's just here, let's talk Turkey. Oh no, that's the wrong phrase.
Okay, thanks a lot. I think we can still collect 2 or 3 short questions. I will collect them, and you can answer them in combination. There's one by Hannes Swoboda already.
I think it was a fascinating overview, and I couldn't agree more with what was said. The only issue where I think we have to think more is the electrification and the whole issue of batteries and rare earth. Because there are experts, and I tend to believe them, that there is not even enough earth available, realistically available, maybe in the ground, but realistically available to go for the Green Deal as it is now, with a total electrification in Europe and around the world. So either we go for different technologies concerning batteries with less use of rare earth, or this is the issue on the open technology issue, go for producing e-fuels, not e-fuels only for cars, but methanol, methane, and other issues. So I think when you spoke about it, I agree, and we have to think about the technology of today, how we manage it. But at the same time, we have to find new technologies, because otherwise it will not be possible to implement the Green Deal as it is now for Europe and for the rest of the world.
Absolutely, Hannes, I couldn't agree more. I mean, estimates varies, but a sort of middle estimate that I've seen, which is not the most extreme, but also seems to me realistic, is that we will have to mine more earth by 2050 than we have done in the past 70,000 years. I mean, so we're talking immense amounts of territory that has to be churned up. And of course, when confronted with that sort of statistic, you've got to think of different technologies, but you've also got to think about what can we do actually to change our consumer habits in order to need less of this material. Here, this is one of the reasons why I focused on Chinese technological development. At the moment, the world leader in producing sodium batteries, which are much easier to make because sodium is much more available and easily available than lithium, is China. In fact, there's really no one else competing with China. The only thing that they're struggling to overcome at the moment, but they're moving towards it nonetheless, is that you need bigger sodium batteries, physically bigger, in order to power a vehicle for the same distance. But I'm fairly confident that in the next 5 to 10 years, the Chinese will have this technology, and I'm fairly confident that they won't be sharing it anytime soon either.
Oh. So 2 more questions by Franz Nauschnick. A short one, please, and Michael, and then we'll collect him. And,
microphone for the audience.
oh, okay. until the microphone arrives, yes.
One question on the optimistic side, for example, the European Task Force carbon pricing, we are collaborating with the Chinese and also with the Americans, even the Republicans, on carbon pricing. And the Chinese have introduced in 21 carbon pricing based on the European model, helped by the CBAM, the carbon border tax, which the Commission told them if they do not introduce it, they have to pay in Europe. So this helps, and if we can have a carbon club, China, EU, US, the others will have to follow, so this could be a solution and could help enormously.
Very true, and it's an important point of optimism is China understands that it too, it's not just us who realize that we have to collaborate with China. China is very aware of the consequences of climate change, much more aware than large parts of the United States, for example. And so we are destined to work together on this. There are some issues around carbon pricing which are a matter of concern, particularly some greenwashing that certain fossil fuel companies are engaged in, particularly outside of the European Union. But there's also one thing that very few people, I think, appreciate is that our oceans and the flora of the oceans store annually 10 times more carbon than all of the rainforests around the world. Now, this is really, really important because although it's really critical to save the rainforests, even more critical is to save the mangroves, the seagrass, the corals, and so on and so forth. And we need a concerted effort on this, as big, if not bigger, than the one that we currently deploy in trying to restrict the destruction of the Amazon, the Congo, Indonesia, and other similar rainforests.
So one last. Sorry, I have to stop. Then one last question by Michael.
So thank you for a brilliant lecture, as expected. Well, I have 2 segments of my question. One is, how do you evaluate the adaptability of corporate structures in Europe, and Germany in particular? And I think, linked to your analysis, there's always 2 levels of policy making, the national state and the European Union level. And the European Union level is a lot in the news, but from a financial point of view, less important than very often the national state. So I think these are linked to that. I couldn't think of also thinking that your analysis is rather partial, because there are weaknesses, of course, in Europe, but there are also weaknesses in the other main actors. Yeah, the dysfunctionality which we see in the US political system, but also a major rupture in state-business relations in China. Yeah. So how do you evaluate it in this context of major weaknesses of all the major players?
Well, I was asked to speak on Europe after Ukraine, and so that was my main focus. But if you want me to come back next year and do the US or China, I'm perfectly happy to do that as well. I think China, as you point out, the issue of Chinese debt is one which you can't you can't get around. And I'm not an economist. I'm just told by economists that I have to keep my eye on it as something with potentially very serious implications. And the United States, I mean, the main weakness of the United States is we could have Trump and a Republican Congress in November 2024. I don't think we will, incidentally, because although I said that nobody else had set a concrete goal like Brexit, a really key moment last year was the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe versus Wade, because neither Trump nor DeSantis nor really anyone else in the Republican contenders can repudiate that decision and say it was the wrong decision, because they alienate the bulk of their Midwest and Southern voters. But we have election after election that has proved that Roe versus Wade has had a really significant impact on voting intentions in the United States, away from the Republicans and towards the Democrats. So once we have the ferocious catfight of the Republican primaries out of the way next year, it's going to be an uphill struggle for either DeSantis or Trump or whoever else may emerge as the candidate. And on the positive note, Biden, who is so unprepossessing in so many ways, actually, because of the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the other legislation that he has succeeded in introducing, may turn out to be a transformative president. And by that, I mean a transformative president in the way that Reagan was, in the way that Kennedy was, in the way that FDR was. American politics tends to go in these broad cycles. That is a shift in the overarching narrative, which since Reagan has been essentially a neoliberal narrative. And my feeling is that the Republicans realize that the change in that narrative is coming, which is why they are so desperate and seeking such extreme responses to what's happening. So if Biden can stay on his 2 feet, literally, because I'm sorry to say this, but if Kamala Harris turns out to be the candidate next year, then the Democrats are done. If Biden can stay on his 2 feet, then there is a real chance that he will win, and a real chance that he can continue the work that he's done up until now, which has been, in a sense, much more productive than somebody like Obama was able to achieve, although obviously under different circumstances.